So tonight's presentation will be by Judy Ball, titled "The Foundation is Cracked and the Roof is Leaking." Her talk will provide a historical perspective of our political chaos. Judy holds a BA in Political Science from West Virginia University and a Master's in Public Administration, as well as a PhD from Maxwell School at Syracuse University. She spent 20 plus years in health services research with agencies of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In her retirement, she has continued in various forms of public service. And we're really grateful for that. I know many of you know Judy, and some of you know her through the League of Women Voters. Tonight, however, she's presenting her own perspectives and experiences and not those of the League of Women Voters. Carry on. So with that, Judy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak here tonight. This is a rare opportunity to speak with my own voice, not representing any organization. And I'm frankly delighted to be here, sort of unleashed, you might say. So even though I speak for myself, I'm also not here as a partisan. Personally, I do not believe that one party or one group, not even Trump voters, is the source of the political and social chaos we're currently living in. And as I've written previously, I do believe that regardless of who you voted for, we're all in the same boat now. And ironically, when I wrote that last bit back in August, I didn't realize I had come so close, unintentionally, to quoting John Lewis. He said, "We may have come here on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now." And I said, I'm in good company, I'd say. So tonight, I'm just going to talk about some things that come from me. And of course, my biggest task in these interesting times was not in finding a topic, but in limiting myself in how far to go. I confess that my purpose is not necessarily to offer solutions, but I do have a few trial balloons to float, and I wish I had more solutions. But the problems we face are profoundly difficult to solve. I do intend to provoke you, hopefully to make you think, and to think beyond tomorrow's headlines. And you may choose to disagree with me, especially the historians or the political scientists or the attorneys in the audience. Do it. Disagree all you want, please. I welcome your disagreements. So let me begin with a metaphor. I love metaphors. This one comes from architecture or building and construction. But let me assure you, I chose this theme long before the East Wing of the White House was reduced to you may hear some related matters, but really, White House vandalism was not my inspiration. But keeping that in mind, and in your mind's eye, imagine a beautiful building. Sometimes we observe the exterior of a structure that is oh so magnificent. And that alone leads us to believe it must be sound at its core. In this metaphor, I'm thinking not of an actual building, but of the highfalutin words of the preamble to our Constitution. We the people. That beginning, those three words are undoubtedly the best part. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Such aspirations. What happens, though, when the inner workings don't live up to the lofty ambitions, like now, but also in our history? Now, our Constitution, our original one, had beautiful aesthetics. That soaring preamble, checks and balances, separation of powers, a Bill of Rights, 10 amendments just to start. It was so magnificent. So structurally, our government was designed in the 18th century as a three-legged stool. Stability was ensured so long as all three legs were intact. Now, this is not magnificent, but it is structurally sound. But otherwise, the Constitution was pristine in its verbiage. So pristine that the term slavery was never mentioned. However, there were many accommodations for slavery. Though silent, they were there. And the rights? Well, those rights didn't apply universally. In retrospect, we know, or we should know, we need to know, the process that created the Constitution was steeped in a series of compromises so egregious, I believe, that the original document established a government, a country that was destined to fail. And so it did in 1861. So let's go back and put all this in those practical architectural terms. First, what happens when a building is erected without a stable foundation? My earliest religious education often used one vivid illustration to highlight the need for a stable foundation. The preacher would say, "What are the consequences of building any structure on a foundation of sand?" It was always sand. So many times I heard that in church, with the conclusion always that no good long-standing thing ever came of building on sand. Sand is an unstable foundation material. And over time, it will undermine, it will erode. Usually the building's corners and then its other parts will begin to collapse and slip and slide. And as goes the base, so will follow the remainder of the structure. And that's just the foundation. Second, what happens when a building is constructed with framing members that are compromised or unstable or not strong enough to withstand its own weight? There's a reason modern building codes require 2x4s and 2x6s and beams and steel. A building with framing not to code may stand for a while before it collapses, but it will collapse. And what if the framing is inferior in quality or infested by termites? Obviously, the process will accelerate. Third, what happens when an addition to a building is constructed without considering the attachments that are needed to secure it firmly to its original structure? We've seen or heard of decks or balconies with such attachments that have spontaneously detached and fell off buildings, taking their human loads down with them, because gravity is a powerful natural force. And finally, question 4, what happens when a leak develops in a roof but is not repaired? Infiltrating water will cause structural damage, both localized and distant from its origin. Only direct action will stop the destruction and its spread. So each of these structural deficiencies, I believe, is apparent in our original Constitution. The foundation was compromised from the beginning. The framing members and attachments were not designed for the expansion to come. And leaks that appeared soon after adoption were papered over with more compromises. And we can thank especially Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas for this. So all of this led to the ultimate collapse, the rupture of the Union and the Civil War, the bloodiest military conflagration in U.S. history. The most recent estimates I could find suggest that more than 1.5 million casualties occurred including 750,000 deaths. And let's think of that in context. The 1860 census counted 31 million in population overall. A casualty rate of 1.5 million is nearly 5%, 1 in 20. So in addition to those original structural problems, our America has a problem still with what I call historical amnesia. We either don't learn our history, we learn some deviation from historical truth, or we conveniently forget what we've learned. Remember the adage, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it? Oh, how that applies to us, to our American culture. So let's go back in history to see what we can learn about for today. We are divided today. We all know that. But our nation has been divided before. Now, I've written previously about how we have, in fact, experienced 2 civil wars. However, our history usually isn't taught that way. Whenever someone says Civil War, we typically think of the one from the 1860s. But that's actually the second one. Our first Civil War was the Revolutionary War. Imagine my surprise when I was driving along somewhere and I heard Ken Burns, yeah, that Ken Burns, talking about the American Revolution as our first Civil War. I first heard him say that back in October on NPR when he was marketing his most recent documentary. And that documentary focuses mostly on the patriots in the American Revolution. Well, full disclosure, I came to the exact same conclusion independently. And I discovered that the Revolution was our first Civil War, before Ken, from my DNA ancestors, some of whom were loyalists. Now, most of us don't remember, or we never learned, that the American Revolution, our first Civil War, led to somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 American loyalists fleeing to Canada. Lots of other loyalists went elsewhere in the British Empire. And all of that left about 3.9 million new Americans to be counted in the 1790 census. But the loss was consequential. Before, during, and after the war, those loyalists, they were also citizens of the colonies, they were also subjects of King George. They faced violence, intimidation, confiscation of their property, and vilification by their so-called patriot friends and neighbors. Some didn't even decide to choose sides. They were simply not loyal enough to the patriot cause. So they were labeled Tories and persecuted anyhow. And I think that sounds familiar today. Now, we don't think much about how the loss of those folks from the newly formed 13 states would have an enduring impact on their country of origin, our country. However, for those who went to Canada, their immigration north played a major role in the formation of Canada as it exists today. Canada is a very different nation than ours. It was created by evolution, not revolution. Ours is a country created by violence. Those are well forgotten consequences for the United States, even today, I believe. So then we have that Civil War of the 1860s, the second one. Quite a lot of attention has been paid to the Civil War itself, so I'm not going to go there. I want to focus instead on how the rebellion of the 1860s was left to go largely unpunished. That seems to be another feature that goes along with our chronic amnesia. So, for example, I can recall my history lessons painting General Grant as a most honorable soldier and leader, in part because of his sympathetic treatment of General Lee and Lee's soldiers upon their surrender at Appomattox. The surrender was carried out in a well-orchestrated ceremony where Lee's soldiers marched between 2 columns of Union soldiers and surrendered their heavier weapons, their artillery, their long guns and such. Then, officers and soldiers alike were permitted to keep their sidearms and their horses, and they're simply told to go home. They were not taken as prisoners of war. Yet our history books tend to record this surrender as humiliating for the Confederates. Just go home. That's humiliating. The lesson I see, no enduring consequences. You may recall also that the Lee Plantation in Arlington, Virginia, was confiscated during the Civil War and became the military cemetery that we know today. Yet, after the war, the Lee family sued, and the Supreme Court eventually found that the property had been seized without due process. Then, the US government actually purchased the land from the Lee family. In other words, the family received compensation for the property seized during the rebellion that they participated in. The lesson, no enduring consequences. When the time came, When the time came for President Andrew Johnson's first amnesty for Confederates who had engaged in rebellion, Lee actually applied, but he was deemed ineligible. He did sign an amnesty oath in 1865, swearing in part to, quote, support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Union of the States. Ironically, that part of the amnesty oath was really similar to the oath he had sworn in 1829 when he was commissioned into the U.S. Army. At that time, he swore, quote, to bear true allegiance to the United States of America and serve them honestly and faithfully against all their enemies or opposers whatsoever. Irony. The good news, I suppose, is that amnesty was denied to Lee on his first try in 1865. Ultimately, though, in 1868, just 3 years later, he qualified for a full pardon and amnesty for the offense of treason against the United States. Now, here is a sketch that was published at the time of President Andrew Johnson issuing pardons to rebels at the White House in 1865. This is not when Lee got his pardon, but it was a whole bunch of other Confederates. And I looked at this sketch, and I think it bears an uncanny resemblance to a pardon. The lesson, no enduring consequences. And later, as we all know, Robert E. Lee became an icon of the Lost Cause movement. To honor the Confederacy and promote the notion that the Civil War and its Confederate heroes weren't really intent on preserving slavery. If you read the various state secession documents, you'll soon discover how absolutely untrue that is. Then, in 1952, Lee's portrait was hung in a place of honor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. That portrait of Lee in his Confederate uniform shows him with an African-American man, presumably an enslaved man, in the background leading Lee's horse. Now, I've looked up that portrait, but I will not show it here today. That painting went up in 1952. Almost 100 years after the Civil War began, but the Lost Cause movement had reached a pinnacle. Jim Crow was flourishing, and backlash against President Truman's integration of the military helped fuel the Lost Cause propaganda and lies. That portrait remained at West Point until a federal law was passed in 2022, requiring removal of Confederate symbolism in the military. That law was one response to the murder of George Floyd. Then, in August 2025, just a few months ago, the current administration began to put those Confederate symbols back. That Lee painting has been returned to its place of honor by order of the Pentagon during the Trump administration. And whether this is legal certainly has been questioned because the 2022 law hasn't been repealed. But legality, it seemed to particularly matter with this administration. So to summarize, Lee was a graduate of West Point. He even served as the superintendent of the academy. Then he chose to resign his commission in the U.S. Army to fight for the Confederacy and take up arms against the country he had sworn to serve. Now, West Point has a motto, duty, honor, country. How do we resolve the clash between the Academy's motto and its continuing to honor Robert E. Lee, a graduate who committed treason? The lesson? No enduring consequences. So, one final example. Skipping forward in time, January 6, 2021, another instance of insurrection without consequences. That insurrection tried mightily, but failed, to derail the counting of the Electoral College votes for the 2020 election. We all watched it live on TV. As you may recall, the Capitol was trashed, law enforcement officers were assaulted, some disabled permanently, others died. But Mike Pence was not hanged, and the votes ultimately were counted late in the night. Afterward, President Donald Trump was impeached by the House, but the Senate failed to convict and remove him as the instigator of the riot, the insurrection, and the attacks on law enforcement and the Capitol itself. Under our Constitution, impeachment is not easy, but it's possible. On the other hand, conviction with removal is virtually impossible. Since 1789, after the Constitution was ratified, 8 federal judges have been impeached and removed from office. 8. That's it. So far, no president in our history has been removed by impeachment. 3 have been impeached. Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, Trump twice so far. And 1, Nixon, of course, was driven from office by the threat of impeachment. For Trump in 2021, removal was the minor issue. His term was nearly up, but conviction in the impeachment trial would have kept him from running for office again. And that means it was not minor. The Senate's failure to convict, followed by a Supreme Court ruling on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment in 2024, set him up to run again in 2024. The Senate's inaction on the second Trump impeachment left the criminal justice system, the U.S. Department of Justice, and the federal courts to seek consequences, legal remedies for January 6th, if any were to be had. Various charges were filed, although none of the January 6th participants were charged with insurrection. And DOJ did achieve convictions, many convictions. But then, in 2025, a re-elected Trump used his presidential power to issue full pardons for more than 1,500 January 6th rioters. And he's continued with more pardons. The lesson from January 6th, same as before, no enduring consequences. So all of this sort of begs the question for me of what consequences might have been levied, what consequences would have been appropriate, and those questions led me to think about the distinction between retribution and justice. Too often I think they're conflated as being the same thing. We've certainly heard a lot of loose talk in the last year or so about retribution. Its recent usage appears to coincide almost perfectly with the dictionary definition, which is literally payback. Other synonyms, vengeance, retaliation, revenge. Perhaps we can agree that this is the retribution we've been hearing about and seeing play out. But is it the right solution for any of these events? Should retribution ever be a consequence of political disagreements or personal animus? We've probably all heard how the practice of an eye for an eye taken to an extreme will leave everyone blind. So yeah, consequences for wrongdoing may be necessary and appropriate, but perhaps there's another way to get there, something other than retribution. Justice is the alternative. Justice is the ethical and philosophical idea that people should be treated impartially, fairly, properly, and reasonably by the law and by arbiters of the law. That laws are to ensure that no harm befalls another, and that where harm is alleged, a remedial action is taken. Under justice, both the accuser and the accused receive a morally right consequence merited by their actions. The consequences we have failed to see across our history, the ones I've enumerated, out of the many I could have chosen, are the lack of justice, I believe. So now, chaos today. 249 years after declaring our independence from a monarchy, and with 236 years of Republican small r government under a creaky constitution that harkens back to the 18th century, we face a new set of challenges. And we face a stark question today. Will we make it to 250 years? For me, it brings to mind those founding fathers who literally put their lives on the line when they signed the Declaration of Independence. They said, "We mutually pledge to each other our fortunes and our sacred honor." How things have changed. We appear to have a president run amok who believes he can rule by executive order, by fiat, regardless of what the laws are, what the courts are, or what the Constitution says. Personally, I do not regard this as the behavior of a king. There are lots of kings in our modern world who don't act like that. This is the behavior of a dictator, a tyrant, a fascist. This is not a king. The response of Congress? If anything, that's even scarier stuff. Those aren't just my words. We've heard members themselves talk publicly about their fears. We have also seen members of Congress, state lawmakers, their families, their pets, judges and their families being murdered or surviving attempts to end their lives. Many members of Congress would prefer to be silent or resign their offices rather than uphold their oaths to the Constitution and perform their Article 1 responsibilities. Who among them in 2025 is willing to pledge their life, their fortune, or their sacred honor? Is their sacred honor to be found? Now, the federal courts do appear to be doing their jobs to the extent they can. However, their efforts are often thwarted by the brick wall that is the Supreme Court. Our current Supreme Court is choosing to uphold executive actions and do much of their judicial action in the shadows, in the darkness of the shadow docket. Rulings of questionable urgency issued with limited formal briefings, without oral argument, and without written opinions. That's the shadow docket. These practices not only make law that is impenetrable, it undermines the lower courts by making precedent, which they must follow, invisible. So the Constitution, written with the vision of separation of powers and checks and balances existing among three co-equal branches of government, is being eviscerated. This is the very definition of a constitutional crisis. That three-legged stool, it's teetering. Is there precedent for this? We hear the term unprecedented a lot these days. It seems to be applied to all three branches of government, but especially the presidency. But is what we're living through really unprecedented? Have we ever experienced anything like this before? I wanted to test that hypothesis, whether this is unprecedented. And doing my best impression of Rachel Maddow, I even tried to dress like her tonight. I went looking back through our history to find out. And what did I learn? Yeah, precedent. Lo and behold, there is an example in our history that seems to fit. Imagine my surprise when I learned that Abraham Lincoln seems to be our one president before now who chose to violate the Constitution in multiple ways with various and ever-shifting justifications without adequate controls by the other branches of government. Who knew? The credit for my discovery goes not to Rachel, but to Harvard Law professor Noah Feldman and his book called The Broken Constitution. What I learned from Professor Feldman is that Lincoln had many transgressions which may look familiar to us today. In fact, Lincoln's actions led me to wonder when, or if, the ends justify the means. And I hope you'll consider that question as well for us today when we're done here. So, what did Lincoln do? I want to tell you two juicy stories that I had never known before, and maybe that'll be true for some of you too. First, he took the country to war against the Confederacy. Now, we all know that. So you may find that an unusual place to start with Lincoln's transgressions. However, you may recall, even in 1861, the Constitution said Congress had the power to declare war, not the president. And we tend to think that Congress waited to give up that power until the 20th century, after World War II. Not so. Now, Lincoln faced a few problems with entering into war, though, and these were constitutional problems. First, this was not a foreign war. Could the U.S. make war on its own people? That was a complicated one because it was not addressed in the original Constitution. Framers didn't think about that one. Yet, by the time Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, 7 states had already seceded. He came into office with a plate overflowing with problems. And the war, in the beginning, was only marginally about slavery. Lincoln was on record at that time as being okay with permitting slavery to continue, as provided for in the Constitution, our Constitution. Lincoln had just taken an oath to uphold the Constitution with all its compromises on slavery, the silent ones I talked about earlier. To Lincoln, don't forget, he was a lawyer. The Constitution meant what it said. Neither he nor Congress could interfere with slavery, except as the Constitution permitted. Now, the Constitution did allow Congress to ban the slave trade after 1808, but that was a far cry from banning slavery. Yet, when the Confederate States wrote their own Constitution, it said slavery would continue in perpetuity. Irreconcilable differences. So how did Lincoln manage to untangle this knot to get from there to war against the Confederacy? Well, it took some backing and forthing. I'll give you the short version. He decided that the Union was unbroken under the law unless Congress said otherwise. But Congress couldn't say otherwise. They couldn't say anything. Even with the emergency, Lincoln let 11 weeks lapse before convening Congress for a special session on July 4th, 1861, a symbolic day. And by then, 4 more states had seceded. In his July 4th address to Congress, Lincoln chose his words very carefully. Don't forget, he was a lawyer. He decided to refer to secession as rebellion. And with rebellion came treason. Those are words in the Constitution. All further action depended on that one word, rebellion, because it was in the Constitution. And Lincoln then said that the seceding states had broken the Constitution, and he, as president, had the legal authority and constitutional duty to restore it. Remember when Trump said, "Only I can fix it"? I read this about Lincoln, and that's what I heard in my head, was, "Only I can fix it." The idea of the broken Constitution, not a broken Union, was a practical tool also. It altered the rationale for the war. The war was not about slavery anymore. It was about preserving the Union. And that was better PR for recruiting militia from the North and the border states. And Lincoln needed troops to fight this war that he had signed up for. But bottom line is, Congress never passed a declaration of war. Now, the second transgression was an even bigger constitutional issue. Lincoln did some constitution breaking of his own. Specifically, he suspended habeas corpus unilaterally without Congress. And what does that mean? Are any lawyers in the audience? Okay. I'm not a lawyer either, but I'll put this in terms that I can understand. The writ of habeas corpus is the most basic form of judicial oversight. It's fundamental to the rule of law. With habeas corpus suspended, the government could arrest anyone and hold the person indefinitely without judicial review. Sound familiar? In the Constitution, the power to suspend habeas corpus falls under the powers of Congress. Article 1, it's not a power of the president. But Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus without Congress being involved. How did this come about? Well, in 1861, militia from the Northeast were traveling south by rail to protect Washington, D.C. And when they got to Baltimore, the rails to the south were damaged by Confederate sympathizers. And their goal was to keep those troops from making it to Washington, which needed protection. Think of the geography. D.C. is literally surrounded by Maryland and Virginia. And Virginia had seceded and became the heart of the Confederacy with the capital in Richmond. Maryland was a slaveholding state, a border state, with many Confederate sympathizers. Now, Lincoln didn't want Maryland to secede, but he needed those troops. So he needed to protect the railroad carrying the troops. To protect the railroad, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, or he had the military do it for him, while Congress was not in session. As I mentioned, between inauguration in March and July 4th, Congress was not in session. Arrests ensued. Now, the Maryland legislature did meet, and they voted not to secede, but they also voted not to reopen the railroad connections to the north, and that led to more arrests. Eventually, martial law was declared in Baltimore. And Chief Justice Taney, I call him the originalist, said this was unconstitutional. But he also recognized he had no ability to enforce his decision. And yes, indeed, Lincoln ignored him. So once Congress was in session in July, Lincoln tied his suspension of habeas corpus to his authority to call up the militia, which he had done without congressional authorization. And he suggested that he had broken the Constitution to save it, to uphold his oath, to uphold it. Well, Congress eventually acted in August. They didn't bless what the president had done or give him authority to suspend habeas corpus going forward, but they didn't penalize him either for what he had already done. So Lincoln came up with a logical explanation for all this. He called it the doctrine of necessity. Secession blocked execution of the laws, and Lincoln had taken an oath to take care that the laws were faithfully executed. Those words appear in the presidential oath. It's the take care clause. He asserted that he was justified in blocking a single law, habeas corpus, because it enabled him to execute the rest. To defeat the Confederacy, he needed to draft an army, even though Congress had never declared war. And therefore, he concluded it was necessary to suspend habeas corpus to deal with anyone threatening to interfere with the draft. It took Congress almost 2 years to pass the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act, March of 1863. And that act gave Lincoln the authority to suspend habeas corpus throughout the U.S. But even then, Lincoln simply ignored the provisions of the act that he didn't like. Sound familiar today? If we define a sovereign dictator as someone who creates exceptions to existing laws, Lincoln certainly qualified. And I think I saw a lot of parallels with today. So what was the outcome of all this? There were literally tens of thousands of military arrests of civilians under Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, tens of thousands. And I discovered other unsavory history from Lincoln and his military also. He suggested that the rule of law itself might not apply during wartime, and that the courts with trial by jury might be incapable of holding traitors to account. Think about it. You've got a jury with only one juror sympathetic to the Confederacy could let a traitor off. He felt that free speech and freedom of the press were threats to the cause, because either might induce some soldier somewhere not to fight or someone not to enlist. He sanctioned preventive arrests. He even suggested silence could be complicity with the enemy. Undemocratic and unconstitutional. These are not ideas that we would associate with the great president that we revere. In retrospect, it's impossible to know if suspension of habeas corpus and the multitude of other violations of the law were necessary, using Lincoln's words, to prevent the Union's demise. But notably, neither Congress nor the Supreme Court put a stop to it. And that might sound familiar too. The one thing Lincoln could do, however, was consider alternatives. And he never seems to stop looking for alternatives. In 1862, he began changing his approach and looking for a moral basis for the war and the Constitution. He came to believe, as I have, that the Constitution itself was immoral and would need to be remade without its original compromises. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were designed to correct that immorality. But only the 13th was actually ratified during Lincoln's life. So Professor Feldman reminds us that all of Lincoln's transgressions were largely forgotten and amnesia taken down. After the war was won and he was assassinated, and those two events occurred literally within days of each other. The professor refers to the posthumous deification of Lincoln as the savior of the Republic, and that's the story we have all learned. I tell you these stories about Lincoln not to trash him and convince you he was a bad man. Rather, he was absolutely a man in a bad situation who did what he thought was the best he could do. He was creative, undeniably. But was he always right? Probably not. But what he did and how he justified his actions are important lessons for us trying to survive another bad situation, albeit with a lesser man at the helm. But anyway, I have no expectation whatsoever that our current president will ever go looking for a moral basis for anything. So in the end, we can reasonably argue that Lincoln did restore the Union. We can disagree about his methods. He did change his mind. He did write and issue the Emancipation Proclamation, even though his initial reasoning was more strategic than moral. He did remodel the Constitution once he decided to seek a moral basis for it. And then he was assassinated, and amnesia took over. So perhaps my story for today is not really about Lincoln, although I think it's a useful trip down its history lane, but rather about a constitution with a cracked foundation and leaky roof that led us to ruin and was only partially remodeled. A Facebook friend of mine, I hope she's here tonight, I'm not sure that she is. She recently did a whole series of daily posts highlighting each of our Constitution's 27 amendments. Each post described the purpose of the amendment, why it was necessary, and what it accomplished. And I thought that series was a great public service. You don't find a lot of public service on Facebook. When she finished with number 27, I commented on how unusual it was that our 18th century guide to good government had only been amended 27 times. Almost immediately, another commenter expressed a completely different perspective, that the original Constitution had squeezed so much perfection into so little space that it only required 27 changes over the course of its life. A few simple changes is how he put it. You may agree with him, you may agree with me, or you may have some other perspective. That's all good. Because I want this discussion tonight to make you think about hard things. But I do not accept that the 27 amendments were a few simple changes, or that's all the changes we need. So the remodeled Constitution. I agree that those 3 Reconstruction amendments represented massive changes. Amendment 13 abolished slavery. 14 established birthright citizenship, overturned the awful Dred Scott decision, guaranteed that states cannot deny anyone life, liberty, or property without due process, and provided for equal protection of the laws for all people. Not all citizens, by the way, all people. And then Amendment 15 established voting rights for previously enslaved men. And going back to my architecture metaphor, I agree with Professor Feldman that these 3 amendments essentially remodeled the basis of our entire Constitution. But, big but, without proper enforcement, white supremacy and domestic terrorism soon took over again. We call that Reconstruction, the Great Betrayal, and Jim Crow. Those are such sanitized words. The Constitution had changed, but many of the big problems did not. So where do we go from here? Today, looking around us, I see more cracks in our foundation, and we have buckets working overtime to catch all the rain coming through our leaky roof. In short, we have issues. We have many issues I've never mentioned. I'll name just a few, and these are not all mine. There's no provision, for example, in our current Constitution to prevent a felon from becoming president. Felons can't get many kinds of jobs in the private sector, but they can be elected president. There are no guardrails on the presidential pardon power. None. Our Supreme Court and Congress right now are devolving power on the president in shocking ways, and they're giving up their power and not exercising it according to the Constitution. And there's no accountability. Our Supreme Court, especially, is using its power to give the president a free pass and to take rights away from citizens. They don't even attempt to hide it. And structurally, our House of Representatives is, over time, becoming less representative thanks to manipulation of districts. And our Senate is similarly so when California and Wyoming have equal weight in the Senate. These are issues. Now, I don't blame the framers for this. I think the framers simply couldn't conceive of needing to address issues like these. In modern day parlance, we would call this a failure of imagination. I would say there are limits, understandable limits, to the situational awareness we can expect from a bunch of privileged white dudes writing a document in 1787 to be applied in 2025. They were situated in the 18th century. They were creating a system of government from whole cloth. They had to compromise to get it done. They did have to tack on 10 amendments right away. It was that imperfect from the get-go. But we're no longer in the 18th century. No, we're in a 21st century mess. And the only thing that frightens me more than the current mess are those folks who think that once this administration is gone, everything will be all right. We can just go back to how things used to be. That is no solution at all. And to illustrate why this is a bad idea, let me go down a little bit more into the constitutional weeds. I want to end by talking about our First Amendment. I used to be a First Amendment hawk. I thought, past tense, our First Amendment was nearly perfect. I truly believed that bad speech, harmful speech, hate speech could be countered by other points of view. I don't think that anymore. Our First Amendment protects hate speech. Our current political and social environment is awash in hate speech, in part because of these protections. Even more than issues with the Supreme Court and the Congress, I think this may become our downfall because of how it contributes to our divisions. When the First Amendment was written and ratified, modern technologies didn't exist. And even the most vigorous political disagreements had points of attenuation. That's no longer true. Even the president is spouting hate speech on social media and in public on a regular basis, and some of us believe his purpose is division, and he's succeeding. So why is First Amendment absolutism a real and growing problem? Basing their decisions on our Constitution, our courts have long protected vile acts, cross-burning, neo-Nazi marches, inflammatory public speakers, KKK rallies, just to name a few cases. I picked those out from 1949 up through 2011. And more recently, we have unregulated social media content that attacks and disparages individuals and groups, while leaving users with no way to distinguish fact from fiction. It's another epidemic. Is there a solution to our epidemic of hate speech? Well, again, I went back in history, but this time I looked beyond our borders. With our addiction to American exceptionalism, we rarely notice that someone else might have some really good, possibly better ideas. And I believe they do. I found models that may be instructive. I'm just not sure how to get there. So what did I learn? Most democracies have hate speech laws. And those laws peacefully and effectively coexist with democracy. It's the United States that's the outlier. Data from around the world show that restrictions on hate speech are not contrary to democracy. To work, the idea is to strike the right balance, free expression balanced against the need to protect the vulnerable. Obviously, that means placing value on protecting the vulnerable. And that's something the United States doesn't do particularly well. Never has. So what did I discover? Here are some countries that restrict hate speech. These countries are not obscure, and they're not the ones you might think of. And this is not a comprehensive list, but you can see how widespread these protections are. And they're all democracies. So I think Germany's model is especially relevant for us at this time. After World War II, Germany needed a new constitution, not a remodeled one. And they really needed to start over. The new post-war German constitution has many articles from which we could learn, and I'm briefly going to highlight just two. So Article 2 focuses on personal freedoms. It says every person shall have the right to free development of his personality insofar as he does not violate the rights of others or offend against the constitutional order or the moral law. For post-war Germany, I read this as being sort of introspective and understanding consequences, something we haven't been so good at. But it also illustrates the need to balance one person's rights with every other person's rights. And now skipping ahead to Article 5, freedom of expression. This is roughly the equivalent of our First Amendment. It covers freedom of speech and press. I'm going to focus just on speech. Every person shall have the right freely to express and disseminate his opinions in speech, writing, and pictures, and to inform himself without hindrance from generally accessible sources. And then it goes on to say, these rights shall find their limits in the provisions of general laws. Now, I found this especially interesting because the German Constitution doesn't try to spell it all out, and free speech is not absolute. It leaves room for the law to take care of the details. And my initial reaction to this was, well, that's a risky way to do it. But perhaps the risk I saw reflects my American bias. I've spent my life steeped in the absolutes of our Bill of Rights. Interestingly, when I went looking in other countries, I learned that rights don't have to be absolute to be valued. These limitations appear in other democracies' statements of rights too. For example, I found a caveat similar to Germany's in Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It speaks to reasonable limits that can be justified in the furtherance of a free and democratic society. Germany, Canada, they're not the only examples. So to learn more about what the limitations might be, I went to German law and learned about how the German criminal code limits speech under the confines of the constitutional protections. Germany defines hate speech as speech that incites hatred or assaults human dignity against people based on their racial, national, religious, or ethnic background. It prohibits hate speech, including speech made publicly or online. Holocaust denial is prohibited explicitly, and personal insults online or in person are crimes. The law also addresses symbols. It's illegal to disseminate Nazi propaganda, share Nazi symbols, and make pro-Hitler statements. And the contrast here is really sharp. We protect statues that honor traitors. And finally, for online speech, there's special provisions. There's active online policing of hate speech. We don't have that. And there are actual penalties for large social media firms to protect against hate speech and misinformation or fake news. We don't have that. So I'm not telling you about these detailed elements from other countries as proposals for the United States necessarily. But let's remember, Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms was enacted in 1982. Germany got a brand new constitution after World War II because their system had utterly failed and needed to be replaced. Our Constitution permits, in fact, it protects hateful speech, symbols, propaganda that Germany recognized from their experience were harmful and deadly, both for themselves and for the world. And many other countries have protections that we lack, and we have essentially no such protections. So, in conclusion, when I was studying constitutional law as an undergrad at WU, I adopted Justice William O. Douglas as my personal civil rights hero on the Supreme Court. In 1949, Justice Douglas defended free speech absolutism. One case out of Chicago stands out. It involved a public speaker who was arrested for violating a city ordinance forbidding any breach of the peace. And writing for the majority, Douglas argued, there is no room under our Constitution for a more restrictive view of free speech, for the alternative would lead to standardization of ideas. That's what we've often heard about the First Amendment, that to restrict speech is to standardize. But Justice Douglas, I think, raised an interesting question. If there's no room under our Constitution for limiting free speech, does that suggest our Constitution should change? Should we make room for some restrictions? Now, the framers wrote our Constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation because the Articles of Confederation had failed. Clearly, they wrote our Constitution for the ages because they made it so hard to amend. Professor Jill Lepore, also from Harvard, wrote a whole book recently on how hard it is to amend our Constitution and the consequences of that. In terms of process, she says that the framers built intended to build a constitutional door, but instead they erected a constitutional barricade. Therefore, only 27 amendments in 236 years. And don't forget, 10 came in one fell swoop and 3 in another. But regardless, here we are, between a rock and a hard place, kind of like we were in 1861. Our system of government, that three-legged stool, is threatening to topple. We have a wannabe dictator, or a real one, and we have a dysfunctional government otherwise. The separation of powers is in tatters. The checks and balances are not working. Is this how authoritarianism takes over in the United States of America? Is there no remedy? I don't think that the solution is making the Constitution easier to amend, because that's a slippery slope. An Article 5 convention, we don't want to go there. The alternative may be rather to reform the one institution that is most responsible for warping our constitutional guarantees of rights and liberties. And for this, I point to the Supreme Court. Some of that reform could be done by Congress, a functional Congress. That's the one concrete suggestion I have to offer, a reformed Supreme Court, which can be accomplished by Congress. In the last Congress, there were literally dozens of bills focused on Supreme Court reform. We need to resurrect some of those bills in the next Congress, and we need a next Congress willing and able to do the hard work. I don't know how we survive this otherwise, but our first job, I believe, is to recognize where we've been, demand accountability and justice, which so often we've simply skipped over, and wake up from our national amnesia. Time's a wasting, and we have work to do. So the one thing I absolutely believe is we can't just go back, as so many are suggesting when this administration leaves. Those of us in the white cis majority tend to glorify the past, which wasn't ideal at all for so many of our friends and neighbors. Going back, making like an ostrich, putting our heads in the sand, is simply no solution at all. I'm happy to take your questions.
So there is this move to have a constitutional convention. Is it Article 5? And I get worried about that, and apparently a number of states have signed on to that. Does that look like something that's threatening us?
A number of states have signed on to it, and you're right to be concerned that oftentimes the way Article 5 conventions are presented is, well, they'll go at it and they'll address this one or two items on this list. The problem is, once an Article 5 convention is convened, there's no assurance that they'll keep to that list. And the groups that are pushing for Article 5 conventions tend to be very right-wing. They're the Project 2025 folks. We don't want to go there. Yeah, go ahead.
You raised many issues that I think each would take an hour to go, but I want to address one thing, which was the concept of not necessarily free speech. And let me put forward an alternative, and that is free speech is good and absolute, but the solution to stupid free speech has been neglected at least in the last 20 years, and that is education. people need to be informed enough to know when something is stupid.
Yeah.
And Macmillan said this way back when he, and I think the King's Speech even has that, where he says, the purpose of education, when he talked to the people at Eton, the purpose of education is to say when a man is talking rot. And that is the primary purpose of education. And we have neglected that, it seems to me, not just in this country, but in others. And I think upholding education and making it more rigorous would allow speech to be freer, even stupid speech, which then can be overcome.
My biggest concern is that the way our Constitution is written, our First Amendment is written so absolutely, and the free speech part of it at least has been upheld so completely within those absolutes that we don't have much wiggle room unless we have a court that's going to find another way around Amendment 1. I was really surprised and I thought the education thing, I was pleased to find out how some other countries have handled this. But they didn't handle it with an 18th century tool.
Most recently, I learned through the Rachel Meadows show that there was a program called Ice Block.
Yeah.
It was an application,
Yes.
and you could use, similar to like Waze, where it tells you there's a cop, it will tell you where ICE law enforcement was. And the Trump administration got Google and Apple to not allow that app to be downloaded. And the people that developed the app are now suing on violation of First Amendment rights. What are your thoughts about that?
I saw that report. What I think most about it is we have many capitalists in this country who are just bending over and doing anything and everything they're being asked to do, regardless of the value. I mean, we've got universities doing it, we've got huge corporations doing it, it's everywhere. I don't understand a country where people who used to wield a lot of power have simply given it all up. I hope that First Amendment challenge works. The one thing about that app, if you have it, is we learned that the app, if you already have it on your phone, it still works. It's that you can't, if you don't have it on your phone, I don't have it on my phone, you can't download a new copy.
People have turned to Waze to mark icy conditions on their Waze maps.
Yes.
At the end, you spoke about the Supreme Court, and I was wondering what specific suggestions you have that Congress could enact. For example, increase the number of justices, or that, or what else could we try to do to improve the Supreme Court?
There are two basic structural reforms to the Supreme Court that have been suggested that Congress could do. One is to increase the number of justices on the court. The last time the court was expanded was in the 19th century. But the number of justices has been changed, I think, like 8 or 9 times over our history. So it's not like it's written in stone. So I think changing the number of justices is a good idea because, and I don't call it court packing, I call it court balancing. The not doing anything to alter the size of the Supreme Court over a century and a quarter, the court hasn't kept up with the population. I mean, that's the simplest way of putting it. But in addition, just having more members of the Supreme Court might give us a more balanced legal view of the world. The other possibility is term limits, and I'm sort of agnostic on term limits. Term limits, the Constitution says that federal judges serve lifetime terms. So in order to change that would require a constitutional amendment. Well, forget that. But there's at least one proposal out there that suggests that one way to get around the constitutional provision for lifetime terms is to designate, sort of take the lifetime term and cut it up into segments and make the lifetime term into the time when a justice would be sort of fully on the court, on the bench, and then another part of their term would be devoted to sort of other work. They would still be a member of the Supreme Court. They would still be recognized as a member of the Supreme Court. They would still be paid as a member of the Supreme Court. And one of the things that would help with is, justices don't like to recuse themselves on court cases because then it leaves an even number of justices, and God forbid they should end up with a tie. But if you had these sort of extra justices in abeyance, you could use those to fill in for justices that recuse themselves. This happens in the circuit courts. This is not an unusual idea, but it's a practical and creative way to get around the constitutional provision of they have to serve for life and they have to, all these other things associated with that lifetime term. So it would not require a constitutional amendment. It could be done by Congress, and it would be, I think, potentially useful. Now, the reason I'm agnostic about this is I don't think age is the thing that necessarily makes Supreme Court justices that we ought to get rid of them. I would be happy to have Ruth Bader Ginsburg still sitting on the bench. But we obviously have to do something because the court that we currently have isn't serving the country. Yeah.
It's one other thing that can be done. And the Supreme Court has no authority under the Constitution to decide constitutionality of laws. Congress can't simply pass a law saying the Supreme Court cannot review this.
Yep.
So that would be one way of getting around things like Citizens United, is that to pass a law saying, it's illegal for corporations to donate money to political campaigns, period. And the Supreme Court cannot review this.
Yep, that's another way. Changing the jurisdiction of the court. What the court can do and not do can be altered by Congress. A functioning Congress. Yeah.
How about a requirement that the candidates have to have 25 years of experience practicing law, which prevents really young people to come in and serve on the Supreme Court for 50 years.
I don't know how that would work out. One of the things I know that is that our justices, not just on the Supreme Court, but also in the federal courts writ large, is that justices tend to come from a fairly narrow slice of the legal profession. There are very few judges and justices who weren't prosecutors in their prior lives. Ketanji Brown Jackson is an exception to that. We have one person on our Supreme Court who was a defense attorney. So I don't know about the age thing. I always get uneasy about ageism. Why is that?
I don't know, seeing an elderly Supreme Court judge than just somebody that's in there forever, like that's what they were doing now, like getting really young people in, and now they'll be in there.
Yeah, I always try to take those hypotheticals and turn them around and say, well, what if it was a justice that you liked? Would you want that rule applied to them? And I don't know that that's necessarily the case. Just like I don't think that term limits, that they ought to necessarily be kicked off the court when they reach a certain age. I don't think that's a good way to go. There have been a few, rare, but a few instances of federal judges being, I don't know whether they were sort of eased out or if they were impeached for cognitive decline, but that's really unusual. Yeah.
Can't justices be impeached by Congress?
Absolutely.
I thought so.
As far as I know, it's never happened.
By a functioning court or Congress.
That never happened on the Supreme Court. There have been, as you
Yeah,
said, 8
I
judges.
said there have been eight federal judges over the course of our history, 8 over the course of our history, who have been impeached and removed. I can't tell you how many federal judges we have had in that time frame.
I think almost all the ones that were removed because they were, caught taking bribes. I mean, it was really like
Yeah.
felony level stuff that.
Yeah.
Certainly a record part.
If you're interested in this book, I really recommend it.
Wondering what your thoughts are, or anybody else in this room who has seen it, about the new Ken Burns documentary.
I have seen it.
I have not, but I heard the Fresh Air interview and I was very intrigued.
Well,
I'd like to see it.
after I heard him on NPR, on Fresh Air, him talking about my idea about that being the first Civil War.
You stole it
How
from you.
dare he? I watched it. I watched all 12 hours of it. I told a friend of mine it was 12 hours and she went, oh, you gotta be kidding. I was disappointed in it. I thought it could have used substantial editing. Obviously his point of view was more the patriots than it was the loyalists. Although I was glad that he actually mentioned the loyalists a few times. But I don't know, it was just, it needed editing. 12 hours was just too much. I mean, the war went on forever, but still, that was too much. Did anybody else watch it?
I've watched a lot of one episode, we all fell asleep watching. It's the one after New York and Long Island,
Yeah.
and that one just was very slow.
Ken Burns has a point of view that, if you can't tell, I don't really share. He deifies the framers. I can't do that. I just can't do that. So, Ken and I have some issues.
You're doing a whole lecture on the Supreme Court for Ollie, aren't you?
Yeah, what I'm doing for Ollie is talking about how the League of Women Voters put together its position on the federal judiciary, which up until this year, we didn't have one. which meant that if there were any legislation that was coming through the Congress about changing the structure of the Supreme Court, we had no way to do any kind of advocacy. And we've been there before, and that was not a good place to be. Important legislation, the League of Women Voters has to be silent. So yeah, I'm doing a class. I'll be doing one of those 2-minute previews at the Ollie meet and greet next week.
Oh, at the second week of January.
The second week in January. And it's one day, and it's not on Zoom. So if you want to come, if you want to sign up, you're going to have to come. Yeah.
Would you advocate for teaching civics in high school again?
Do they not teach civics in high school anymore?
I don't think so.
Okay, here's my issue with teaching civics. Some of you may have heard some stuff tonight that you didn't learn in your high school civics or your high school history classes or your college history classes or any other history classes. That's my problem with teaching civics in our schools. It's all this made up crap. It doesn't tell the real story. And if it does, please let me know. I'm happy to hear if it really is happening, because I think one of our problems is people do not understand where we came from. And so they have all these fancy ideas in their heads about what a wonderful country this is and how we've always been a wonderful country and, freedom and liberty and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but that's not teaching civics.
I'm sorry?
I said, that's not teaching civics, sorry to disagree.
No, it's not
That's
teaching
teaching
civics, but-
propaganda. Civics ought to be taught.
But I don't know what it's like now. I don't know.
It isn't.
I'll be honest, I don't know what it's like now. When I was in school, that's the kind of crap I learned.
I mean, I had to convince someone that was roughly as old as I am, but had the good fortune to be born in this country, that the term of a US Senator was 6 years.
Has anybody ever tried taking the citizenship exam? Without having to?
I helped somebody review the questions,
Uh-huh.
and I thought it was pretty easy.
Yeah, I did too. On the other hand, the questions were such that I think most American citizens, educated as American citizens, probably can't pass it. Anyway, anybody else? I'm so sorry I kept you so late.
Excuse me.